made special arrangements for a campaign. What was that campaign called?
The campaign of 1876.
Okay, perfect. Now, our first subtopic is Custer finds trouble prior to the campaign of 1876, because is he not fully reinstated and ready to roll, right? Who pushed to get him reinstated so he could be part of all this stuff? Sheridan. So he's ready to go, but he's going to find himself some trouble prior to the campaign. Now, in the original plans for the campaign of 1876, Custer was going to command what we called the Dakota Column. It was a column of infantry and cavalry that included the famous 7th Cavalry. So he was going to control the Dakota Column. He was going to be in command of the Dakota Column. That was the plan. And this was more than just the 7th Cavalry. It was a complete army battalion with both infantry and cavalry. And it was a big assignment. It was a very important assignment. So he was going to command the Dakota Column. That was the plan during the preparations for the campaign of 1876. Well, during the time they were making those preparations, Custer was called to Washington, D.C. to testify in a trial. Okay? He was called to Washington, D.C. to testify in a trial. So when you're testifying in a trial, usually someone's done something wrong, right? And they're on trial and you're testifying either for or against that individual. Okay? Well, the person that was on trial was W.W. Belknap. He was the Secretary of War. And he had been accused of making illegal monies in the Indian territories. So on trial in Washington, D.C. was Secretary of War W.W. Belknap. And he was accused of making illegal monies in the Indian country. So we got a scandal in D.C. implicating the Secretary of War, and Custer's been asked to go there to testify. So he's either going to testify in behalf of W.W. Belknap, or he's going to testify against him. Okay? Now, the thing that made it kind of iffy is this scandal that included Secretary of War Belknap also implicated Orville Grant, the president's brother. Okay? So to make this even a little more sticky, this scandal, including Secretary of War W.W. Belknap, who was accused of making illegal monies in the Indian country, also implicated President Grant's brother Orville.
How do you spell that? Orville?
O-R-E-V-I-L-L. O-R-E-V-I-L-L-E, actually. Orville Grant. Now, Custer gives his testimony, and it's damaging to both Belknap and Grant. And he is, Custer basically insinuates that both Belknap and Grant received illegal monies from this dealings in the Indian country. In other words, they would rip them off in trading. Okay? They would give them things of less value and then take their money. Well, it led to who being incredibly mad at Custer? President Grant. And so he suspended Custer again and stripped him of his Dakota command. President Grant was so upset at Custer's testimony that he again suspended him and stripped him of his Dakota command. Matter of fact, he would have 0 role in the campaign of 1876 altogether.
So what is suspended for? Because wouldn't you have to have like a reason or custody?
Yeah, but he's the president. I mean, seriously. In that time, he's a lot different. He was the president. He could suspend anybody he wanted. Okay? And people had warned Custer. Sheridan and Sherman both had warned Custer. Even Libby, his wife, had said, be careful what you say in the trial.
So wait, but he was technically doing the right thing for Grant.
Well, it depends on whose perspective. Grant thought he was lying to damage his brother and the president. So you can look at it different ways.
But Grant was the one who disliked him, right?
Right.
Did
So
Custer dislike the president?
he didn't really dislike him. He just
They just
didn't see eye to eye.
Okay.
Well, however it worked out, all of a sudden, the president suspends Custer, he takes away the Dakota command, and he basically says he will not have any role, won't even be going on this campaign of 1876. So who does Grant replace Custer with to lead the Dakota column? General Alfred Terry. And he's not only gonna be the commander of the Dakota Column, he's also gonna be named the overall commander of the campaign of 1876, because it's gonna come from several different sources in different areas. It's a campaign. So he's also the overall commander of the campaign of 1876, and he will personally lead the Dakota Column, because there'll be a Wyoming column and there'll be a Montana column. They're all part of this campaign of 1876. And Terry will lead the Dakota Column that was originally Custer's, and he will be the overall commander of the entire campaign. This was not a really good choice, because General Terry was kind of considered a pencil pusher. What does that mean if you're a pencil pusher in the Army? Yeah, you do a lot of Army paperwork. You're not involved in battles or commanding battalions of men. You're a pencil pusher, means that you're not in the middle of the fight. You're doing the paperwork. Okay, you have a lot of police officers that when they, just before they get ready to retire, they get off the streets and go in to take a desk job, do the pen, be a pencil pusher. And Terry really wasn't the right choice for this, but he couldn't turn the president down. Well, Custer was just desperate. I mean, he was just in horrible shape. He pleaded with Terry to at least let me go with the Dakota Column. I mean, I'm not asking for a command. I just want to be a part of it. So a desperate Custer met with General Terry. He pleaded with him. He asked him for the opportunity to at least accompany Terry's command against the hostiles. And do you think Terry wanted him to go? Yeah, he wanted him to go because Terry had no expertise in fighting Indians or fighting anybody. So he wasn't against Custer going at all. But he didn't have the pull or influence to convince President Grant to let him go. He just didn't have it. He didn't have what it took. So what did Terry do?
Snuck it.
No, what did you say? What? I didn't hear you. What did you say? What did Terry do? Because he wants Custer to go. Who did he convince? Who did Terry go talk to? Sheridan and Sherman. And he said, go talk to the president and see if you can get Custer reinstated again. I need him. So General Terry knows that he doesn't have the influence to convince President Grant to allow Custer to go. So as a result, General Terry turns to the men who he knew had the president's ear. General Sherman and General Sheridan. Well, both those men went and talked to Grant again and expressed their opinions. And Grant wanted no part of it. He hated Custer. Finally, he listened to the two and said, I'll let him go, but he will not be a commander in this campaign. He can go, but he will not command troops. So here's Custer reinstated again. He's only allowed to go with Terry. He's not allowed to command. So in May of 1876, Custer rejoins the 7th Cavalry at Fort Lincoln in the Dakota Territory as they prepare for the campaign of 1876. So in May of 1876, Custer rejoins the 7th Cavalry, which is part of the Dakota Column. He arrives at Fort Lincoln, named after Abraham Lincoln, in the Dakota Territory, and prepares himself for the campaign of 1876. Custer's back. But he can't do what, Anna? Can't command. I wonder how the hell he got control of the 7th Cavalry then. We'll see. So that takes us to the organization of the campaign of 1876. I'm going to tell you what it amounts to. If I can draw very good, probably not very good. Not bad, huh? Montana, Wyoming, what is this? The Dakota Territory. You know, Link, you all didn't know this, you know that General Custer went through North Dakota, right, on the way to Little Bighorn? And he told everybody in that area to act stupid until he got back. Anyway, never got back. Anyway, good North Dakota joke if you're into that. Not as funny as the DAP, I take it. Okay, anyway. The campaign involved 3 commanders. We already know one. General Alfred Terry was going to control the Dakota column. Which was stationed at Fort Lincoln, by the way, that is near present-day Bismarck, North Dakota. So the first part of the campaign was General Alfred Terry. He commanded the Dakota column, which was stationed at Fort Lincoln, which, if you care, is near present-day Bismarck, North Dakota. The second part of the campaign involved General George Crook. And what column is he commanding? The Wyoming column, which was stationed at Fort Fetterman. A fort that was named after Fetterman after the massacre. Anybody know what town in our conference that we play it's near, Fort Fetterman? Douglas. Very good, my dear. Douglas. Okay? So, General George Crook is the commander of the Wyoming column. They are stationed at Fort Fetterman, near present-day Douglas, Wyoming. So they're in this area here.
Maybe a little farther down.
And the third column is under the command of Colonel John Gibbon. And what column is that? The Montana column. They were stationed at Fort Ellis, near present-day Bozeman. So, here are the 3 parts of the campaign of 1876. The Dakota column, stationed at Fort Lincoln, near present-day Bismarck, North Dakota, under the command of General Alfred Terry. The Wyoming column, stationed at Fort Fetterman, near present-day Douglas, Wyoming, under the command of General George Crook. And the Montana column, stationed near Fort Ellis, near present-day Bozeman, Montana, commanded by Colonel John Gibbon. Yes?
Is Gibbon where is it the Gibbon River in Yellowstone? Is that what that is?
That's where that comes from, yeah. Absolutely. Good, yeah. Now, keep this in mind. This is where you got to pay a little bit of attention. Each of these military campaigns, and there are 3, were prepared to fight on their own and act independently if necessary. Okay, keep that in mind. Each of these 3 commands were not only prepared to fight on their own if needed, but to act independently if necessary. What's the goal behind this campaign? What are they doing? Now, if you don't know that, we shouldn't be in here. What are they doing? They're trying to contain the Native Americans to the reservation, and if they will not go, they will move them by force, which may include extermination. That's the goal. So does it make sense they could act independently? Because they don't know where these hostiles are, and that's our next part of the story. Okay? Now, the idea was these 3 leaders were to meet on a steamship by the name of the Far West. The 3 leaders were going to meet with their commands, and they were going to meet individually, or not, they're going to meet as a group on the steamship Far West.
On a steamship?
Steamship.
Like a legitimate ship.
The ship, yeah.
Name?
It was named Far West, yeah. Now this ship was docked in the mouth of Rosebud Creek. The mouth of Rosebud Creek. Now, what's the mouth of a river mean, or a creek? The mouth is where it ends, where it runs into another body of water. So where is the Far West? Where is it on this map? Right there. That's where the Far West is. And what happens is Terry is going to come from this direction, Gibbon is gonna come from this direction, and Crook's gonna come from this direction, and they're all gonna meet on the far west, and they're gonna discuss military strategy concerning these hostile Sioux and Cheyenne Indians that they are trying to find and do what? Put on, no, don't get that ahead of it. Contain and put them on the reservation. And if they won't go, they'll take them by force. So what they're doing is Crook is coming from Fort Fetterman north to the far west. Gibbon is coming east from Montana to the far west. And Terry, the Dakota column, are coming west towards the far west. And they're all going to meet on that ship and discuss strategy concerning those. Well, Gibbon left on March 17th, 1876 with a force of 450 men. You need to know this. Gibbon left the Montana Territory on March 17th, 1876 with a force of 450 men. Gibbon left on March 17th, 1876 from Fort Ellis with a force of 450 men. Terry, along with Custer, remember, left on May 17th, 1876 from Fort Lincoln with a force of 900 men. Terry, along with Custer, left the Dakota Territory on May 17th, 1876 from Fort Lincoln with a force of 900 men. And Crook left Fort Fetterman in the Wyoming Territory in mid-June with a force of 1,200 men. Crook left Fort Fetterman in the Wyoming Territory in mid-June with a force of 1,200 men. So Gibbon has 450. How many does Custer and Terry have? How many is that? 1,350 plus 1,200 is? 2,550. Keep that in mind because we'll need to know that. 2,550 is the force that they're going to take to the far west looking for hostile Sioux and Cheyenne Indians to put them on the reservation either willfully or by force. That's what we got. Okay, let's go to our next subtopic then, which is departure from Fort Lincoln. Departure from Fort Lincoln. So who are we talking about? Which group? And the Dakota column. Okay. We mentioned they departed from Fort Lincoln on May 17th, 1876, and they camped for the first night. So they marched and then camped for the first night. Now, during the first camp, they paid the soldiers. They paid them for the campaign on the first camp. Why did they pay the soldiers after they left Fort Lincoln instead of just paying them before they left? They didn't pay them till we camped. Well, they weren't going to leave. I think that's a good guess. They weren't going to desert because they knew that. But what did they want them doing? Buying a bunch of beer, he said. He's right. Didn't want them all drunked up and didn't want them spending their money on loose women, if you know what I mean. So they wanted them to stay away from prostitutes and they wanted them to stay away from the booze. They didn't want them to have any money before they departed on the campaign. They wanted them fresh and alert. And they knew that if they'd have paid them at Fort Lincoln before they left, they'd have bought whiskey and prostitutes and then have been in no shape to depart the next morning and probably not been very alert to fight. Okay, so they paid them when they got there. Now, they allowed the wives of the officers to ride with the command to the first camp. And they were able to stay overnight with their husbands, and then they were sent back to Fort Lincoln the next morning. So the officers were allowed to bring their wives. They traveled with them the first day of the campaign from Fort Lincoln. They stayed overnight with their husbands, said their goodbyes, and they were sent back to Fort Lincoln, and the campaign continued. That was just a perk of being an officer. Okay, none of the enlisted guys or entrymen or cavalrymen even had families there, so it was only officers. Okay, that takes us to maybe the biggest key to the Battle of Little Bighorn that we're going to face, and that's the Battle of the Rosebud. I wish we had time to take you there, because there's a battle site there that we'd love to see, but it's way out of our area. Okay, we'll get a start on this today. Well, we mentioned to you that General Crook and his command departed from Fort Fetterman about mid-June, right? They had a force of 1,200 men. And they arrived at Goose Creek near present-day Sheridan, Wyoming.
Who are you talking about again?
Talking about General Crook. General Crook and the Wyoming command departed from Fort Fetterman, and they arrived at Goose Creek near present-day Sheridan, Wyoming. Now keep that Goose Creek in mind, because we're going to drive right over it when we drive through Sheridan, and it's got quite a historical significance. So General Crook and his command departed from Fort Fetterman and arrived at Goose Creek near present-day Sheridan, Wyoming. On June 16th, they left Goose Creek and they arrived at the Montana-Wyoming border the morning of the 17th. And they were camped. So General Crook and his command departed from Fort Fetterman, arrived at Goose Creek near present-day Sheridan, Wyoming. On June 16th, 1876, Crook and his command left Goose Creek, and they arrived right here at the Montana-Wyoming border the morning of the 17th. And they camped. Okay, rested. Well, that morning, General Crook sent some Indian scouts that were working for the military over a nearby ridge to observe the areas, and then